Few ideas in business are as commonly discussed as leadership. Just think about all the business books and articles and videos and bits of advice out there, all dealing with this topic. And sometimes with common ideas, we forget exactly what we're talking about. So today, we're going back to the basics and talking about what is leadership actually. In this episode, we discuss. Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about, what are we even talking about when we talk about leadership? And it's not just being in charge and making more money, right? All right, and we're going to talk about what do we know about leadership and how it actually works, and how we each make progress in our own leader development journeys.
That's great. And one thing that I just thought of as you were talking about those different parts of what we'll discuss today, that piece of what do we know about leadership and how it works. We're not actually talking about what do Ben and Chris know about leadership, although that'll be part of it. Because we come from a perspective of, hey, people have been studying this thing for a long time. And so we're going to discuss that. And we're going to discuss what is known through research and through evidence about this thing that we call leadership. So let's hop into this and maybe start with this first question with regards to what are we talking about when we talk about leadership? And perhaps we can start with what people commonly talk about, right? So, sometimes I hear people use leadership as, and I've done this too, use leadership as a noun. You say in terms of talking about a group of people, leadership did this. Leadership needs to decide, talking about a group of perhaps people in positions of authority in an organization doing things. But just more commonly, what do you think about, Chris, when you think about leadership?
Well, because we're in this space, Ben, I think about the glut of awful things I've heard about it along the way, right? Look, he looks so sharp in a suit. He must be a leader, all of the primordial ooze that is a cesspool of kind of lay people's thoughts, which have actually gotten better, I got to say, over the years as better information has gotten out there. And then I think about how leadership actually is and works. And it's actually for everybody if they just take the few moments to reflect and develop those concrete things.
That's great. It's interesting because we do have these implicit notions of what leadership is and what leaders do, what leaders look like. And those implicit ideas, we call them folk theories, right? We have these kind of theories about what leaders do and what they look like when they're effective and things like that. It can really influence how we think about this entire topic, right? So let's maybe start with going back to, this whole idea of, is this really different from management, right? Because I think that's a good place to start. Sometimes people say, you'll see this on LinkedIn, for example, you'll see a meme or something where somebody is trying to get a bunch of likes and they say, don't be a manager, be a leader, or, a boss is a manager, somebody who cares is a leader. And sometimes there's a nugget of a kernel of truth in there. Sometimes there's not, depending on how they kind of position it. But I do think that there is a distinction, perhaps, between leadership and management. And it's maybe important to think about if we're trying to get our terms straight. I don't know if it's as important when we think about the real world and how things actually operate.
Yeah. And actually, I would say management skills are more important because 99% plus of people will not be in a actual, as we think about it from the management and, leadership and development type leader stuff, you're not going to be developing strategy for an organization. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But building and leading teams, executing towards a goal and mission that we'll talk more about. Management is probably, if I had only so many eggs to put in a basket, right, for a likely outcome for anybody's life, I'd probably put 80% into the management basket and maybe only 20 in the leadership basket.
That's a lot of eggs in the management basket. I don't know if I'd put that many, but one way to think about this distinction comes from John Cotter, and he's a retired Harvard professor, and he's written some stuff on change and leadership, and some of his stuff is good, some of it I have questions about. But one thing he says that I think is perhaps helpful here is the way he defines it is that management is about dealing with complexity. And certainly in our lives, in our organizations, in our projects, there's a lot of complexity. Management is fundamentally about those activities of planning, organizing, directing, controlling what happens. And that is very helpful, right? It's absolutely essential if you're going to get stuff done. Leadership is about dealing with change and about doing things that have perhaps not been done before and going in a direction that isn't well charted. And that certainly is important too. So perhaps another way to kind of think about it is a continuum, right? Being a leader versus being a manager, things that leaders do, things like establishing the organization's mission and developing strategy for that mission. When you get into the manager's role, it's more about implementing that strategy through others, dealing with the complexity of actually getting things done.
Yeah, and the reason I said 80-20 for me, Ben, is I know of very few people are like, I want to come in and change the entire organizational mission of this org. I think
but
it's
you don't have to. I
misaligned.
mean, that's not leadership can be in very small ways too. It's not just about changing the whole organization's mission.
Sure. But we're just looking at like an enterprise level organization, that kind of stuff. There are times, and Ben and I, we toot this horn all the time about everyday leaders leading from where you are, and we'll develop that. But when we're looking from Cotter's perspective, right, just in this kind of lens, most people aren't excited about organizational mission, competitive strategy, how they do. Most people that I meet and talk to that say, hey, what should I do with my career? What kind of skills? Really what they're talking about is setting schedules, hiring, building teams, making sure people feel fulfilled at work and are being efficient, making sure that they're executing that strategy efficiently. And that just thrills them to death. I don't see a whole lot of people that are like cracking open the strategic management textbooks.
Yeah, but I would separate, the fundamentals of being a leader and this idea of leadership, as we'll get into it a little bit more. It doesn't necessarily have to do with strategy. It can. Some of it does. Like you mentioned one thing in terms of making sure people feel fulfilled at work. I think that's more of a leadership thing than it is a management thing. But they go hand in hand. And perhaps, perhaps there are some blurry distinctions here that don't matter too much.
There absolutely are. But people need to stop putting down management like it's some suboptimal gear.
Yes.
And let's use that to bridge over here. There's this idea of leaders and followers. I do the smart thinking. You guys do the working. That's really not the right way to think about this. And management is I can't think of quality leaders in organizations that don't also have quality management skills.
Precisely. And I enthusiastically agree with that. If you've been in an organization where you only have somebody who is, talking about perhaps the organization's mission and big picture ideas and the vision and all those types of things, but doesn't have any of those skills and doesn't do any of the things that need to occur to get things done, that is a super frustrating experience. So you absolutely need both. But today we are talking about the leadership side of things. And perhaps we can now bring our listeners along to say, okay, how do we think about this? How do people who research this thing called leadership, and I would include myself as one of those people, how do we talk about it? How do we think about this idea of leadership? And so first of all, we don't talk about leadership as a person. Leadership is a social process. It's something that occurs within teams, within groups, certainly in organizations. It's an interpersonal type of activity. So leadership doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? And so It has to do with this idea of influencing, motivating, and enabling others to contribute toward the effectiveness and success of the organizations of which they are members. So these, how do we get people to actually want to do things? How do we create some, aspirational vision of the future so that people can work together and align themselves in a way that is productive? But again, it's a social process, and just being in a position of authority doesn't make you a leader at all. Leadership can occur, and leaders should be sprinkled throughout your organization. One of the things that I tell people who work for me in my military roles is that I expect leadership from everybody. Everybody should be at every level should be at various times exhibiting leadership, and other times being great followers too, right?
Yeah. And I love that you say social process, and it's so important. And one of the definitions for me for leadership is able to create other leaders, right? And when I think coming out of a guitar background, right, I know the steps that it takes for somebody to become proficient at guitar. So if it's like, are you a good guitar teacher? Let me see your students that really latched on. They should be able to rip. Right? And I have several students that are playing professionally in Nashville. So I can validate my ability to teach. And this social process of leadership is more concrete than people think. And so for me, one of the definitions of leadership is able to turn out other leaders, which would mean, if you take a lot of people I talk to initially in our coaching engagements, how do you create a leader? What are the requisite skills? How does a social process work? What are the behaviors you see in that social process? It's like, whoo, and they look at you eyes wide. They don't know. But people who study this actually take a look, and there's ways in which leadership is transitioned from one person to another. And I want to say one more thing on that. That doesn't mean that because a lot of people just have kind of one gear of leadership that they do. And then they turn out a bunch of cronies that look exactly like they do. Now, the problem is those leaders aren't going to be successful outside of this context. And we'll talk a bit about that. What you really want is to be able to know this social process so cold that you can turn out leaders that can be successful in a whole host and variety of contexts, because everything's not the same, even from one day to the next.
This idea of shared leadership, I think, is a really good one. And it's this idea that, even if you are in a position of authority, you are not necessarily going to be doing the leading type work all the time. You might be doing some management type work. You might have individual contributor stuff that you're still responsible for and that you're doing. That doesn't really go away as you get more senior necessarily. Some parts of it do. It morphs, it changes. But this idea of shared leadership is that, this social process of getting us all in the right direction and moving us towards some sort of collective goal, that should be something that we share together. And then instead of saying, those types of things are only under the purview of people at the top, it's inaccurate. First of all, because if you've ever been in an organization where you've had, oftentimes there'll be people who are kind of the informal leaders. They don't have a position of authority, but people really respect them. Maybe they, see a lot of value in their ideas, and people follow them. And those people certainly are doing the work of leadership when they do that. And so I think as a leader or as a person in a position of authority, you should always remember that, hey, we need to do leadership together. This is not just something that I do. I should be inspiring and helping other people do this as well.
I know of very few people that get so senior that they don't have to validate what's on their PowerPoint slide that they're going to brief at a strategy senior meeting. They're in the weeds and not in the weeds on stuff. So,
right.
Ben, when's the last time you did PowerPoint?
I mean, I still do various pieces of it, right?
Right.
And I was talking to some person senior to me in the military recently, and he was saying, yeah, I
that would be an admiral for the uninitiated.
right, yeah. So above me is an admiral. I am not an admiral, but so this person I was talking to, said that he was working on some PowerPoint slides, and we were just kind of laughing about it because he's like, yeah, I guess I did need to do some things to this to make it right. And you're absolutely right that people in positions of authority, especially over the past year, I've gotten a really cool look at kind of as at the upper echelons of the Navy, at least, how we do things. And I tell you what, we've got some really smart people who have a lot on their plates at the top levels. And when they're going and off and doing things, they have a whole team of people that are helping to prepare them. And there's a lot of leadership that occurs at lower levels to help make sure that that person in the position of authority is ready and able to do their job. So, if we didn't have shared leadership there, it just wouldn't work. It doesn't mean that you're abdicating your responsibility as a leader, but you're giving people authority. In the Navy, sometimes we say that you can delegate authority. You can give someone the ability to make decisions about certain things and to do stuff, but you never delegate responsibility, right? To make sure that something actually happens and gets done and driving results, that still resides with you if you're in a position of authority or if you're in that formal role. So I think if that's kind of what leadership is, and leaders, the way I think about leaders in that context, so I distinguish between leadership and leaders. And leaders are people who you call someone a leader when they are engaging in that social process of influence. And anybody can be in that position, right? So I think it's important to think about things that way. But when we take a step back, I think there's also an important context idea that in order to do that type of work and do it well, a lot of it actually starts internally. Like I have to kind of see myself as being able to lead, or at least having some ability to influence, wanting to kind of put yourself out there a little bit. We're talking in small groups and teams even, and thinking of yourself as having some leadership abilities and being a potential leader in certain situations. That's necessary for you to even, kind of develop in your role.
One of the interesting things about the military is somebody comes out through the Naval Academy, West Point, or maybe they just show up out of an OCS type system. That's Officer Candidate School. And nobody says, do they look like a total stud ready to step into this? There's not that assessment. It's, can you meet the requirements? So are you not a criminal with a drug dealing history? Do you not have a tattoo on your face? Okay, you can start this leadership journey in the military. Then you go to your school and get trained. And they're not saying, did you score in the top 1% of your class? They say, did you meet the requirements of this school training? And then they put you in front of people, right? And I've seen some people that got made fun of and derided along that process by some peers for being kind of wimpy looking. But actually, they were really fast runners, right? They were just kind of scrawny, all right? But could you even climb the rope? Yes, they did climb the rope. So according to the standards that were set by the system, they met the requirements to be a leader, even though their peers, because they were focused on how this person looked. And a lot of people, Ben, we've met senior people that are short, tall, all different looks. And when you start working with them, you're like, my gosh, this guy's actually really good.
Right.
But what is it with us that we take how somebody looks as somehow how they would be as a leader?
So that's a whole other really interesting area of leadership, and of academic study, I would say. And there are some interesting ideas that come from an idea called status characteristics. So we look at these external characteristics and we make these quick decisions about someone's potential or their ability. We do that a lot. And it goes back to kind of those folk theories about what we think people in these positions should perhaps look like. And I think these are cognitive shortcuts that we make. And I think you just got to be careful with the prejudgments that we sometimes impose upon situations and upon people.
I mean, Ben, some of that stuff goes to this idea of competencies, right? In leadership.
Sure.
We define competencies as the personal characteristics that lead to superior performance in a leadership role.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people, when they look at a leader, right, they're thinking, well, I'm a person, that person's in leadership. I'm not. I don't know. Because you were mentioning like people are saying, well, I want to be a leader. What do I need to do? And it almost seems like smoke and mirrors because I'm in here doing my individual contributor, but I think I can do more. But I look at this leadership 1, 2, 3 steps up the corporate rung, and I have no idea what's going on at that level because I just come in, I make the soup every day. I don't know actually what's happening up in that position.
Right. So, well, first of all, if you're just making the soup every day and that you're happy with that, awesome. Right. I think that there are opportunities for leadership that are, that are really at any level. Maybe you have an idea about how to make the soup better or more efficiently. And you start to share that and you start to influence other people, right? Maybe your demeanor around the kitchen as the soup maker, is one that inspires other people to do their job in a certain way. That is leadership. And, before we get into the competencies, I think it's helpful to think about, like, why do we even need this process of leadership? And I think part of it is that you can't make a rule for everything. And, if we could make rules for everything, sometimes you like to say, hey, like, I'd like to have a playbook for this. And I think in many situations there isn't a playbook, and life is too ambiguous and uncertain. And so because
you can't have a playbook that tells you what to do, but your playbook is how to sense and begin to respond to these kinds of things.
Sure. So maybe it's a different type of playbook, I suppose. But you can't make a rule for everything. Leadership in and of itself is oftentimes it happens in these situations where you are doing things that haven't been done before. And this, I think, is where a lot of this really comes back to who you are as a person, how you think about and how you sense and respond to the environment, how your values are absolutely critical because, at the top of an organization, let's say you are at the top positionally, and so you do have the ability or you have the opportunity to, have fairly wide-reaching leadership. You're going to have to make decisions that on unlimited information, and you're going to have to do that in a way that doesn't necessarily have a bunch of rules associated with it in terms of what you should and shouldn't do sometimes. I also think that, we have a changing world. The world is one in which things oftentimes shift. Organizations are oftentimes going through change, and leadership is important in those situations. People oftentimes need direction. We do look to others within hierarchies. We look to others for guidance, right? If two peers in an organization are not working well together, oftentimes they look to the person who is their boss to help lead that situation. And I think there's just another category of stuff where things just don't always go the way they're supposed to in organizations. There's a lot of unexpected things that happen. People don't always do what they're supposed to do. And leaders, when they are doing this thing we call leadership, can provide some structure and provide some direction for how to navigate all of that.
All right. So we go to competencies now?
Sure. Well, I think first let's just kind of talk about how we talk about leadership in terms of studying it, right? How this has happened. So there are a bunch of different approaches towards studying leadership. And what it really started as was this kind of great man, great woman type of idea that there are these people who are very successful in certain situations. Let's study them. Let's figure out their traits and let's do those things, right? And you still see this. You still see this.
This is so good. You can't have a movie, and this is how it gets into the social imagination. You can't have a movie, or I can't think of very many, with a completely unconventional leader. Could you imagine leading the Avengers and Marvel? Or could you imagine MacArthur being a diminutive person with, who wasn't a get out into the front lines, that there was just kind of like a pencil pusher type person. Like nobody would watch those movies because it's part of the popular parlance that leaders have this magical pizzazz of something that's just who they are.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think there probably are some examples of stories and literature and media in which you may have somebody who is, perhaps defies some of those expectations and yet still is effective in a leadership capacity.
Yeah, if any of our listeners have some of those movies, send us an email from the website and let us know. But the majority of this stuff is capturing people's imagination, right? And capturing, the zeitgeist and uniquely seeing what needs to be done or what the group needs to do.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose we oftentimes see this in the popular business literature where you'll see a biography about someone. Now, I like biographies. I like memoirs even. I like kind of hearing people's perspectives, but I think you have to go into it thinking, hey, what this person did in this context made them successful in that context, right? And it made them successful according to themselves if they're writing a memoir, or maybe according to some other people that were selected to be interviewed or whatever. But the problem is that it implies this universal approach. Because General Patton did X, Y, and Z, I should think about doing X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't always work that cleanly. In fact, it most often does not. At the same time, there are some trends, people who are effective in different situations. So we can learn from the people around us. And, as you sometimes say, the monkey do, monkey see, monkey do approach is what a lot of people do in organizations. And it's understandable why people do that, because it is a reference point for people to understand how to operate. And the problem, again, is that if you take lessons from someone who was successful in one situation and you try to apply them in a situation where that doesn't fit, it's not going to work out so well. If someone is, for example, a really directive leader and telling everybody what exactly they need to do, that works when you have a situation where people are fairly inexperienced and they're doing something non-routine. Now, imagine trying to apply that type of leadership style in if you're running a research lab with a bunch of scientists, like that's not going to work, right? That's when you're leading experts. That's a much different situation. So the great man, great woman type trait theories, that's one approach. But then you mentioned, and you brought up already, this idea of competencies, these kind of mishmash of knowledge, skills, abilities, characteristics that we have. And, there are some competencies that it seems like people need to have in order to be successful as a leader, that are, they probably look different in different organizations, different industries, different contexts. But we can go through a couple of these. So, for example, there are some personality characteristics that can be helpful. The idea of extroversion, right, which is where you like being around people and you gain some energy from them. That sometimes is a little bit helpful if you're in leadership situations. Not always. There are some amazing introverts out there who are amazing leaders, but that is somewhat predictive of leadership success. Conscientiousness, right? Being able to pay attention to some details, which is actually kind of more management type stuff, but it does help you, if you're trying to create direction, alignment, and commitment within an organization, it helps be kind of organized when you're doing it.
No, nobody says I want a leader that's not conscientious. What? How could you pull your leadership challenge off if you're not, really paying attention and caring about some of this stuff?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Another piece of this is that some of it comes back to how we see ourselves. So, if you see yourself as having something to offer others, having a unique perspective, having some ability to control kind of what's going on around you, that's helpful. If you're someone who doesn't have a whole lot of faith in your own abilities, it's probably not going to bode well for your ability to lead others if you can't even kind of lead yourself.
Dude, I'm so glad you brought that up. So much of my executive coaching has been focused on getting a positive self concept, right? You're in an organization. Ben, you've been there multiple times, executives crying in the office with me. I remember the first time you're like, do people normally cry in the office with you? And I'm like, yeah, Ben, actually they do. Because we got to get to if you can have leadership at every level of an organization and you want to be a leader, you've got to deal with your demons that are telling you that you're worthless and horrible. There's this whole imposter syndrome and stuff. Who came up with that? Now, sometimes you feel like an imposter because you actually don't know what you're doing. But then that doesn't mean you're horrible. Your self-concept shouldn't be bad in that moment. You're like, oh, well, I need to learn what I'm doing then and get rid of those kinds of things. But everybody's worthwhile. Now, if you're doing stuff that is not worthwhile, if you're being a jackwagon out in society and stuff, you need to knock it off. And then you can start, as time goes by, building that positive self-evaluation and start building some self-esteem there. If you're an executive or somebody in an organization really struggling with a sense of self, work on that first. Everything else comes after that. If you feel really bad about yourself, it's going to be hard for you to get to where you want to go.
Right. And I think part of the confidence that you need to be a good leader is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know and being okay with that. There are certain parts of running an organization that I'm more or less confident in my own abilities. And that's fine, because if I'm in a situation where those things need to happen, I just recruit those skills from somebody else and say, look, hey, this is not my thing. I can understand it. I need you to explain it to me, but you're going to run this piece and it's all okay. Sometimes we come across executives, really leaders at all levels that don't have, I think, some of this self-efficacy, this feeling that they can do things, and they mask it by being kind of, as we talked about in our recent bad bosses, they mask it by being a micromanager, right? So if you haven't checked out the Bad Bosses micromanager episode, go check that one out. So that's self-concept. You also have to have some drive. You got to have some motivation. You got curious people, being, trying to get things done, being action-oriented. That's helpful for leaders and leadership.
Hold on.
And then some things around
on that piece, on the drive. I can't tell you how many people I've asked. Like, this is the most basic question when you're interviewing somebody for the next level. Why do you want to be a leader here? And invariably, I'll hear in tons of different, I just want to make money, or I'm tired of people telling me what to do.
Oof.
Now, that doesn't show that inner motivation to pursue goals. Hey, I think we can do this better, or I think I would offer this to this team. Be honest with yourself. If you want to be really happy, you have to have this base level of your person that loves what you're doing. And then this part of your brain and stuff that's curious and wants to explore. I've met lots of people that don't have that kind of drive. And that doesn't mean that you're bad or suboptimal. There's the leaderships. People are slightly better humans. That's just not true. I know lots of technologists that they just love to be a subject matter expert, and that's it. Right? So you got to do some reflection on what is your drive for this leadership challenge and that kind of thing, rather than I just want to make more money.
Right. And that kind of ties into this next piece, which is integrity is important, and having some consistency between your words, your actions, truthfulness. And you may be able to get into a position of authority without some of this, but you're going to derail if you don't have a high level of integrity. At some point, it's going to catch up with you. It may take a while.
Unless you work in the Scrooge McDuck. What was that movie where they were the stock traders and had DiCaprio in it? What was that movie?
I'm not
anyway,
sure
there are a bunch of people breaking the financial stock trading laws as a whole firm. Now, if you want to work in the mob, you don't have to have integrity. But if you
I would disagree, because if you don't have integrity and you're working in the mob, you're probably gonna get sideways with some of the people around you.
Yeah, I guess that there's honor among thieves, sort of, right?
Yeah,
But these organizations that are horrible, Like that's the only kind of place where people who lack
Yeah.
integrity thrive. And if you find yourself in one of those, try to get out.
Right, right. And it's not to say that everybody, like people may be listening and thinking, I work for so and so, really high level executive has no integrity whatsoever. Yeah, that does happen. But I think it also goes back to like the basic question of how you want to live your life. And do you want to be a leader who influences other people, perhaps through just carrots and sticks? Or do you want to be someone who leads through integrity and through, painting this picture of an inspiring vision for the future and helping people get there, sharing credit, those types of things. So in the long term, I would say that integrity is very important. People who end up in leadership positions also have some motivation to do it, right? That's kind of basic. They have more of a desire to be in a leadership position. One that sometimes gets overlooked because people are like, oh, it's all this kind of squishy stuff. It's like, you also got to have some knowledge of the business. You have to know what that organization does. And by business here, maybe it's more like knowledge of the organization or what, because it certainly applies to nonprofit and to government. You need to understand your external environment. You need to be able to make good decisions. If you don't have some deep knowledge about that area, it's going to be challenging for you.
Yeah. You always have to stay up on your game. I know with new execs that they'll say, well, if I'm not in there doing the work with them, or if I'm not micromanaging, what do I do all day?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it does free up some hours. And it's like, well, how many professional publications in your industry are you reading in a day, week, month? Right?
Yeah.
How many, now, lunches, I remember thinking, what do these execs do going on all these lunches? Well, once I found out, they're talking to meeting with peers and networks in that industry so they can sense and understand and share what's going on. They're just not getting loaded on martinis and drunk driving back to work. Like that's not the game here. It's you actually have to understand your business environment, your competition, what's going up. Top executives can recruit new talent. So if you're going to start a new initiative, they should have a broad-based network of people that they've grown up. Hey, we need to go get Sally. She's incredible, right? Mm-hmm. They're able to pull from that network, which means they spend time nurturing those social things and reading and understanding what's going on.
Absolutely. Another piece that's important is you got to have some intelligence. It's not something that we really can change a whole lot, but your ability to solve problems, your ability to comprehend what's going on around you, that is important. And then the other piece of this is social skill. And some people call this emotional intelligence. But being able to have a good pulse on your own emotions, as well as knowing what's going on with the people around you, is important. So I want to move on from this competencies.
We could do this forever.
I know.
Gosh.
There's a lot more that we can, there's a lot more to discuss here about leadership. Because I think it highlights some tendencies. It may help you think about, okay, if I really want to be influential, I probably need to, work on these few different areas. But leadership is also about your relationships with followers. It's not only within yourself. I think it's important to remember that, and this also comes from the research on leadership from this area we call leader-member exchange. This idea that we have to have good relationships with the people around you. There were some studies that looked at leadership early on that said, leadership involves this idea of initiating structure, right? Creating kind of the context for how things are going to work, how people are going to interact with each other. And then this idea of consideration, making sure that people feel like they're cared about, and maybe not just that they feel cared about, that they actually are cared about as human beings, that they know how they fit in the team, that they have that sense of belonging within the group. So that's very important as well.
One of the things is in the literature is this idea of perceived organizational support. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a dark side of that, because my thing is like, we need actual organizational support. We don't need our followers and people in our org to just think they're supported, only to find out when they need it that they're not. Like, so as a leader, you've got to care. Don't fake this stuff, guys.
Sure. Well, the reason that we call it perceived organizational support is because that's how we measure it. in the social sciences.
Right,
We
right.
ask people their perceptions of organizational support, which is important, right? Because that is in the eye of the beholder. But yes, you're right. I think you can't fake this stuff if you want to do it right. So, the research then kind of moved into this idea of leader behaviors and styles. And I mentioned this idea of initiating structure and consideration, that there are these people-oriented behaviors, there's task-oriented behaviors. I think that's an important thing to think about. And just practically speaking, for myself as a leader, or when I'm trying to do this thing of leadership because of my position, sometimes I think it is helpful to think about, all right, am I doing a good job of initiating, structure and making sure that we have good tasks assigned and making sure people are doing things the way they should be doing? And then at the same time, am I also doing these people-oriented things where I'm making sure people are heard, that I'm listening to them, that I am, checking in on their well-being, making sure that I'm building that trust and respect. And that I think a lot of times comes through the, being a humble leader. You've got to have some humility and be sure that you're checking in with people and listening, making sure that you aren't perhaps going off in the wrong direction, building a culture around you where people are willing to call you on your own garbage. That's really, really important, especially as you get more senior.
People get so task driven. And in our coaching, that's, hey, because assigning the tasks, making sure the rules are followed, that you're driving results. Because if you're an executive, you're reporting to somebody. If you're the CEO, you're reporting to the board of directors. And they're like, where are we in getting all this stuff done? And it can make us focus so much on the task. But an important task for you as a leader, wherever you are, is to not forget the people tasks, right? And because your team, wow, this is such a successful manager or executive, but you go interview their team and they're like, this person doesn't care, because they don't spend those times, parts of your day. And so if you're just sitting there, if you could take one thing out of the many things in this episode, is you need to make sure that you take time out of your week, day, month to actually do some stuff with your people. Now, this isn't like a trust fall, but checking in. Hey, Philson, how are you feeling about how things are going in this organization right now? Right? Or, hey, Janet, I know you just came back after your kid was really sick. Are you okay? It's so easy to get wrapped on the task-oriented stuff that we forget the people curation. And if you're a good leader, like the better leaders, make sure that they spend some time on those items.
That's great. Another piece here is thinking about the situation. So, in the leadership research kind of trajectory over the decades, we started with that great man, great woman stuff, look at traits, look at some behaviors, and we've learned some things along the way. And I think these are all helpful lenses through which we can look at leadership. Another and very helpful way to think about leadership, which does have research support, is this idea of the contingency perspective or the situational perspective. And there are a few different ways to think about this, and some different labels that people have put on all this stuff. But really what this is about is, hey, before I decide what I'm going to do as a leader, if I'm trying to influence a group, I need to look at two things. I need to look at who the people are that are involved, and I need to look at what they're trying to do, kind of what's going on in the environment. Those two things. And if it's people who are, highly skilled and are doing things that they've always done before, well, that's probably more where I just need to set some goals and help remove barriers, right? If it's a group that's perhaps very junior and they're doing things that that they haven't done before, they just don't really know what they're doing, that's where you need to be very directive. So, you can think about it in terms of behaviors of being directive, supportive, participative, or achievement oriented, depending on who the people are, their skills, their level of comfort and experience with the tasks, and what's going on in the environment. And if you do that right, this idea is, then you're going to be effective if you match the situation. And I think the big takeaway for anyone who's trying to be effective as a leader is one size does not fit all when it comes to your leadership style. You need to adapt, depending on what's going on with your people and with the situations they face.
This is so novel that I've been accused by executives I'm coaching. You're teaching me to be a people manipulator.
Mm.
And that is ridiculous. If you come into, you come home from work or something and you see your kid crying on the sofa, do you just keep your same demeanor from the office? Buck up, bucko. Or, where's my PowerPoint? No, you say, oh my gosh, this kid needs empathy right now. Hey, what's wrong? Now, nobody accuses you of adopting the correct demeanor and perspective and inquisitiveness as emotionally manipulating that child into feeling better. No, you're obtuse if you don't adapt. What's that song? I'm the kind of guy that laughs at a funeral. That's the wrong thing to be doing probably at most funerals, right? So adapting your leadership behavior and having different gears because you know what? You need stuff from your followers, right? You need them to do your work, inform you, get along with their coworkers, but your followers need stuff from you. And if you got to adapt, and we've all, any of us that are parents and stuff, sometimes our kids ask for stuff that's maybe like a little bit outside our skill set or maybe not the default, but we have to show up for those kids, our kids, in a way that's meaningful. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Your group, your team needs something from you. And what they need from you is related to where you are in the competitive market space, all of those kinds of things. What's going on? Are you going through a major change thrust? Well, then you're going to need to be doing a lot of communication around change and helping people know it's going to be okay. We're going to get to the other side. This is not a people manipulation or emotional manipulation. This is being the right kind of person that the moment needs from you.
Mm-hmm. When I'm in various leadership situations that I've been in, I always try to, kind of balance the various things that I do in that role. So, for example, I try to make sure that I'm providing some periodic updates that are at a strategic level that they wouldn't hear about otherwise. And in so doing, trying to help connect what they're doing with the bigger picture, right? And because that helps with them knowing kind of what to do and how it all fits together. It's also very satisfying and motivating when you feel like, what you're doing matters. And I also then try to make sure that I'm checking in and that people feel like they can ask questions, that I'll make time for them if necessary, and that I do care about them as people, and so and there are easy ways to do this. And some of this you may say, oh, it's just common sense and whatever. And if it were common sense, it would be more common. But if someone's having a tough time, if they get sick or they have a family member that has an issue, checking in with them about that. That's a nice thing to do. And it also communicates that you actually care about those people. And again, you can't really fake this. You actually have to have to care. But that can be really motivating. If you think about somebody who actually cared about you as a person and, checked in with you and valued what you did for the team, there's probably a lot that you would do in return for that person. There's a decent amount of motivation that would engender based upon their relationship with you.
Yeah. The key word here is relationship quality matters. Yeah. And
it really does.
And that means if you really want to take on this leadership challenge, if you're motivated towards that, practicing building real relationships with all kinds of people around you. And it's not this kind of, transactional exchange. Oh, this person can help me. I'm going to go be buddy with them. If you find out that somebody's just your friend because you have a membership to this golf course or something like that, that really frames you like, wait, this isn't a real relationship. And anybody, right? You only get to meet so many people in this life. And I would say everybody around you is a special treasure. This is at least how I think about it, that you only get one chance with. And really treating those people authentically and actually caring is an important part of that.
So you mentioned this idea of relationship quality. This comes from this idea of leader-member exchange. Another key idea here is it can be very easy if you're not careful to create kind of in-groups and out-groups within a team. There are the people who perhaps you just identify more with or you get along with more. But make sure that you're an equal opportunity leader, that you're reaching out to everybody and not creating those distinctions.
Tell me about an out group, Ben. Like, what is an out group and kind of how does it evolve?
Well, it can evolve in a whole bunch of different ways. But this could be a group within a team that doesn't get perhaps as much attention from the boss. They aren't kind of in the know when it comes to knowledge sharing. They have less face time perhaps with the boss. They don't get treated in a less special way than the in-group would. And it can happen for a variety of reasons, but one reason it can happen is the leader's behavior. They create higher quality relationships with certain people, but not with others. And if you're on the out group of that, you really don't like it because you will essentially see that as the leader playing favorites within that group. And that can be very demotivating. It can also happen through what we call fault lines within teams where for various reasons, people will associate with each other within the team. And this can happen along age barriers. It can happen along other types of demographics where people kind of separate themselves or if there's like some sort of, big controversy and people kind of split into two different sides. That's kind of another layer of an issue there because that's also a team dynamic. It's not just because of the leader, perhaps, but it's something you should be aware of. And you should, as a leader, I think the takeaway here is really try to establish and maintain high quality relationships with everyone on your team. Now, some of those people you're going to like more than others. Some of them you may enjoy spending time with more than others. But try your best to be judicious in how you go about that whole process. And the other piece is going back to the idea that the situation does matter, and you may need to alter how you interact with certain people, given the nature of the situation and what they face.
So if you love SEC football, right? That's a Southeastern Conference for the uninitiated, and you're a big Alabama or a Georgia fan, right? Go Dogs. And you've got a couple people on your team that also love football, and that's all you do is talk. If you hand an assignment to one of those guys, other people on the team is like, oh, that's your buddy group. And a lot of leaders come in with their own emotional wants and needs, and they try to get those met from their team. And it sets up these fault lines just intuitively because there's people that you will naturally have an affinity for. But if you're a leader, you got to say, you know what? I got to get my emotions met from like my family, my community, my peers. I've got to be super, super careful, which means you may not get to tell as many jokes as you want. Like, I like these two guys because they laugh at my worthless jokes. These other people have a real sense of humor and don't think I'm funny at all, right? You got to rise above that kind of thing to make sure that everybody feels included. And sometimes that means going to lunch with somebody you have next to nothing in common with and hearing about their Pokemon collection, right? Because that's just part of the deal as you're curating these social relationships to make sure the team is firing on all cylinders.
In addition to this idea of leader-member exchange and the situational view of leadership, the last thing I think we could possibly talk about a little bit is this idea of transformational leadership, right? When you really are going through some sort of big change within a team, within an organization. Now, some organizations change more than others, but all of them probably change a little bit at various points, right? No organization really stays the same forever. And there are a handful of different elements here, and this really goes more towards some of these leader activities or behaviors, things that you need to do in order to guide that group, that team, that organization through the change. And one of them is, having that vision of the future, having an attractive future that here's where we're headed and here's why, and being the champion for that. The second piece is about communicating that vision. And I think just, communication in general is something that leadership requires leaders need to do it. You oftentimes, it's hard to over communicate. Now, unless you're just forwarding. Now, when I say that, don't just flood your people with emails. I'm talking about real communication, talking about what's going on, making sure people know what's obvious to you isn't obvious to them, because you're operating at a different level if you're in a position of authority. So creating that shared mental model of where you're heading is very important. So those are two pieces that are important: creating that strategic vision and communicating the vision.
Right. So, I mean, this has been a lot. There's so much stuff. So, how should an individual say, like, okay, I mean, I just got a bunch of information. How do I start and progress on my individual leadership journey now?
That's a really, really good question. And I do just want to mention there is more to that whole idea of transformational leadership. There's this idea of being a role model for what you're doing and building commitment to that vision and so forth. But I think, as we're starting to come in on the home stretch here, first of all, I love the question and the idea of a leader development journey, because this is a lifelong type of process for all of us in terms of how we interpret the world around us, how we interact with our fellow humans. And if you are a person who sees some value in leadership, in being a leader, and I do want to address one thing. Sometimes people are like, wait, why are we so concerned about leaders and leadership development? If everybody's a leader, it's not going to work well. Well, that comes from a place of thinking that leadership is only done by people in a position of authority, right? Leadership can happen by anyone. And when I look around at the world around us, I see so many problems and so many opportunities that I do not think we are suffering from a lack of leadership, right? From a lack of, all right, we do suffer from a lack of leadership, right? We don't suffer from a lack of, or a surplus of people we don't have too many leaders right now. We have a lot of people a lot of situations in which we need, progress in the right direction. So I think if you want to get started, I think finding good role models, I think developing relationships around you, developing your own knowledge of your organization, those are all key places to start. Becoming an expert in something is a great way to build your influence.
Yeah. And the thing I would say is, get those mentors, but realize that's one data point out of a whole lot. And there's a lot of leaders that don't now they're doing really well in the situation they find themselves in, but they are not. And we see this in the data of executive derailment. It's like half. So if you're moving to a new position, new organization, about half of those guys and gals will be gone within 90 days. They don't survive because they only have one leadership gear that they can dive into. So I would say get knowledge around the evidence-based leadership literature and start charting out, hey, I do this part pretty well, but I need to start developing, make a list of competencies and other things that you need to start building so that you can be somebody that can jump to different organizations as you want to move up the, career ladder, as it were, and be successful wherever you find yourself landing.
And I think the key to doing all of that is humility, because you have to have a sense and this has to be real. It's not like, okay, I'm just going to get better at some stuff. You have to have a real sense that I'm probably not as good at everything as I think I am. Therefore, I need to learn. I need to listen to the people around me. I think that's really important too, is getting good feedback, honest feedback from subordinates, from peers, from your leaders, trusted mentors. That could be really helpful in learning how to develop as a person and as someone who wants to be effective doing this thing we call leadership.
The last thing I'll add here, Ben, is you got to go get in a leadership position. So if in your job, you're just, making the soup and that's what you love to do, well, I would say go find something in a community organization, a nonprofit, maybe something in your faith organization where you can start organizing things, building teams. You can't read a book on boxing, even if it's the best book ever, and say you're a boxer. Like a boxer's somebody who's at least gotten into the ring. And I would encourage everyone, because the world is ripe with opportunities that need leadership, to get out there and start, yes, develop the training and the knowledge, but also take that to the lab of life and the different leadership challenges that present themselves every day.
There are opportunities everywhere to practice leadership. So get out there and do something. Today on the Indigo Podcast, we've talked about leadership. We've talked about what are we talking about when we talk about leadership? What do we know about leadership and how it works? And we've talked about how we can each make progress in our own leader development journeys. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.